Right. Okay. Very good evening to you. This week I'm going to talk about subnational and local government. We've now looked over the last few weeks at the Constitution, or the philosophical background, Constitution, elements of Parliament, government and the civil service. And this week I want to go below that level to where many people would argue most real politics operates. All politics is local, as an American congressman famously said. And I want to therefore to look at the way in which this system of local and subnational government, not just councils but Scotland and Wales as well, fits into our democratic system and what it tells us really about the purposes at the end, what it tells us about the purposes of subnational government. So if I can just begin by putting subnational and local government in context. The state, and we've heard about the state in previous weeks, but let me just reiterate this, is effectively a community created for the purposes of government, for the purpose of government. It has a delineated territory. Of course, this is less true than it once was, but as a generality, a state might be thought to have a delineated territory, and certainly if it's to have an effective form of government across it, to the edge of it, and to it within its boundaries. A legitimate government, sovereignty within its territory, recognition by other states, a name and personality, control over its entire area, reasonable consistency of government, and of course the right to use force against its citizens. So that's a sort of general view of what the state can do, and a system within which local government can and does operate. State is different from society. State is based on law, whereas society is a free association of citizens, all of us acting as individuals in our private sphere, free to do, in Britain anyway, within the common law, whatever the law does not prohibit. And so there is a difference between state and society. Government, we've heard, may involve one person, monarchy, or a small number, an aristocracy, or all in a democracy. And of course, the United Kingdom is of course mixes and has over time mixed all three of these elements, though it would normally be seen as a democracy these days, but it still has a monarchy at the head as a titular head of state, and has vestiges of an aristocracy still in its House of Lords. There are different models of government: constitutional, absolutist and pluralist. And of course, a risk that any form of government may degenerate towards tyranny, oligarchy or anarchy. And there is an interest in any system of government which all good governance measures will test. If you look at the World Bank's measure of how they compare countries from place to place, they look at accountability and transparency. And another thing they look at is the risk of corruption, a need for checks and balances between elements of the government system to ensure that corruption is avoided, or at least as far as possible kept in check. Government will involve politics. All of life involves politics to varying degrees, not only government, our private lives do, but of a different kind, and possibly political parties. Most mature political systems do have political parties, which may be configured along ideological lines, but of course can be configured along historically different lines. If you compare the UK with Ireland, I think it'd be fair to say that would be broadly very different routes for their political systems. Politics is not unique to the operation of government, and of course exists within government to reconcile different interests. There are other influences on government. The market, most obviously. Britain is often described as a social market economy, a mixture of the market but with government intervention to create a social dimension to the otherwise free operation of the market. It's influenced by expert opinion. If you listen and read debates about British government and politics, you'll hear references to the commentariat, wise people writing in newspapers, opining on the TV and radio, giving us their opinion about how government should be changed. interest groups. We'll hear about them in future weeks, interest groups that will exist and do exist to influence the way government and politics works. And of course, from time to time, and I'm not advocating it, simply observing that political disorder will from time to time have an influence on politics. Those of you who remember the riots in various parts of Britain in 2011 will remember that they did have an instant effect on the court system and government and politics, an immediate response in terms of the way government and politics is, or the pressure under which government and politics will operate. The state and the government, each distinct from the other. The Queen as head of state, we've heard this in previous weeks, embodying the state but not part of the government. The state consists of a wide range of institutions existing, including the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, we've heard about this, the civil service, appointed bodies, delivering services on behalf of government, like the civil service, but now typically, as we heard last week, doing something generally of a more policy delivery nature rather than the policy-making nature. Nationalised industries, many fewer of those than there used to be, though they were traditionally seen as an arm of government industrial policy. The police, the armed forces, the judiciary, and what I'm going to talk about today, subnational and local government. So those subnational and local government, as I'm going to explain, have their own electoral legitimacy, unlike most of these other institutions. They are nevertheless, they would be seen by most people in Britain as a part of the state. Almost all states, though not all, Singapore doesn't actually, but most states include an element of regional and or local government. In what are generally in federal systems like the United States or Germany or Canada, you'll have a federal level and then an intermediary state or provincial level, and in many countries like the United States, the state level can be very powerful indeed. In the United States case, with power over things like the death penalty, an extraordinary degree of independence, telling us something about the way the United States was created, a federation. In unitary systems, like our own or like Sweden, you get a subnational tier of local government. And of course, within state and provincial levels in countries like the US and Germany, you have a local government tier within that state or provincial or land level in Germany. And of course, Britain being Britain contains elements of both. It contains elements now of a federal system, an ill-developed or a complicatedly developed partly federal system, and what would normally be described as a unitary system, i.e., in the end, it's a single system where Parliament and the sovereign Parliament can pass laws that change, and we heard this from Martin Loughlin, can change the structure of government at will, because of a vote in Parliament with a majority anyway, so not quite at will, but it's a system where, even today, the Scottish government, embedded as it is with all the powers that the Scottish Parliament has to make laws, only exists within the legislative system set up by the United Kingdom Parliament in Westminster. This is different to a federal model, where, and most obviously in the United States, was created as a coming together of a number of states into an agreed federal system, which embedded within it powers for the states to have a voice, and a disproportionate voice from state to state, given their size, their population size, within the original federal model. Ours is more like a traditional unitary system of government. So, characteristics of subnational and local government. Often, these systems, the subnational and local elements of a system of government, are enshrined in a written constitution. So if you look at most written constitutions, they will allow for federal and or local government levels built into and given protection by that constitution. As we've heard in previous weeks, there is no written constitution in the United Kingdom, and consequently our subnational and local government is not enshrined within a constitution. And that, of course, explains, just to pause for a moment, why after the Scottish referendum it's proved so difficult for the British machinery of government to as it were, think what to do next. It isn't a constitutional route map. It's all have to, we end up with a parliamentary, or a committee of government, I should say, a cabinet subcommittee looking at the future of the constitution, with the opposition parties separately coming up with their own ideas. Subnational government, like Parliament, involves the control of a unit of government by elected representatives. It shares that with Parliament, and in this sense, the Scottish, Welsh and Northern Irish governments and local government are the only institutions in our system that have this particular magic ingredient of direct election, parish councils, which I would deem as part of local government. They have the power to raise taxation. This is being extended to Wales and Scotland in a way I'll describe a bit later. They too have defined territory. They have lines on maps. If you look up, it's rather more complicated, of course, in Britain than anywhere else. You look up the counties of Old England. There are still counties that are units of government, often not with the same boundaries, but they have a defined territory, and certainly a territory that is defined in law. And, as I always point out, we are here in a building which is in one municipality, but if you go back to the main LSE buildings, or most of the rest of them, they're in another municipality. Every time you cross the street into this building, you're crossing the Camden-Westminster border. So there's a defined territory, and the laws about planning for this building are different from those for most of the other LSE buildings because of the defined territory. They have their own bureaucracy, their own civil service, which shares with the national service, being non-political. Local authority officers are not political in the way that they might be in another country. It's not to say that council leaders might not have their own private office, or mayors where they exist, but generally the local authority officers are a sort of civil service and are appointed to be non-political, and they will survive change of political control within the council. And they have legislative, they're not quite legislative powers, but typically local authorities have their own powers, they're granted, Parliament grants them powers to deliver services. In some systems of government, it's possible for councils to pass their own legislation. If you look at American city government, the city council will often be a legislative body. It's part of the separation of powers between the legislature and the executive enshrined in American systems. In this country, councils, municipalities, and indeed Scotland and Wales deliver services or do what they do within legislation created in the Westminster Parliament, although, of course, the Scottish Parliament and now to some extent the Welsh Parliament can make their own laws in order to change some parts of government within their own territory. Now, what are the theoretical justifications for subnational and local government? Why have another level of government? Surely, particularly in a small country like England, tiny geographical area, smaller than some American states, I would imagine. Not measured that, but it must be true. A small geographical area, much smaller than France, much smaller than many other countries. What are the arguments for having subnational and local government? Well, most obviously, democratic pluralism, part of the balance and checks within a democratic system that allow power to be handled at more than one level. So you're creating a system in which power and legitimacy is available at one level, national level, but also at another level, and with the possibility that different people or people from different political backgrounds or traditions will be in control at one level than another. This happens in almost all larger democracies, and indeed most smaller ones as well. So it creates the possibility for people who are not to be left out of power continuously if one party is in power for a long time. During the 18 years of Conservative government from 1979 to 1997, there were many councils that never ceased to be Conservative control. Sorry, I'll get this around 1979 to 1979, never ceased to be Labour controlled. Buckinghamshire County Council, I think I'm right in saying, which is Conservative controlled, has been controlled by the Conservatives continuously ever since the Conservative Party was created, and maybe the institution in the democratic world longest controlled by one political party throughout all the Labour governments that have ever come and gone. So if you live in Buckinghamshire, you can vote Conservative even if you have a Labour government. So democratic pluralism. Second theoretical justification for subnational and local government would be participation. All politics is local. Elections at subnational and particularly local levels allow far wider participation. London has 73 members of parliament, but 1,600, nearly 1,700 councillors. Chances are you'll meet a councillor more often than an MP. I'm not saying MPs aren't accessible, and actually many students I've certainly known over the years here have gone on to be councillors in London. So any of you with nothing better to do might think you want to get into local government. And I can assure you, whatever party you support, you'll be much welcomed. They like to have new people joining up. Political parties have been suffering from a lack of participation in recent years, so just consider that. So it does make it much easier to access this part of politics and to take part in it. So it's part of a sort of, going back to what George Jones was saying about Parliament as a teaching instrument, see it as that in that way, there's no question that local government has the same kind of attributes. It's a way of getting involved in politics at a much closer level, much easier to do. It allows people to express identity. So people feel loyal, not just to football clubs or cricket clubs or the county they were born in or the city they come from or London, wherever it is, but they can express that identity through a local area of government. Perfectly legitimate way of representing your sense that you may be British or Welsh or however you self-define yourself, and within that you come from a particular town or a particular city or a particular county or a mixture of all of those things, and you can identify with more than one. So that allows people to express territorial identity and loyalty through the government of their area, and many people feel proud of the city, town or county they come from. And then, of course, last but not least, there is the question, and there are other justifications, but the fourth one I'll use here is economic efficiency. You look at the economic literature, it's pretty clear that the use of public resources nearer to where the voters vote the money is likely to be rather more efficient, or at least that's what economic theory would suggest, than at a much higher level of government. And certainly if you listen to free market think tanks, they're generally rather in favour of lower level government making more decisions, because they feel that people will be able to, going back to the point I made a moment ago, have access to the people who are deciding how to use the money, and therefore people at a local level are much less likely to buy make huge grandiose gestures, railways, huge ships, whatever it is, whereas at the local level it's all going to be about things people understand. And therefore this will lead to economic efficiency. So there's a number of theoretical justifications for subnational and local government. There are also, of course, a constitutional basis for subnational and local government. Of course, in Britain, that we don't have, as we've heard about 14 times so far, a written constitution. You know that by now. So what we have, I would argue, in the UK is that subnational government system, which is an artefact of history, like all of British government. It's an artefact of an evolved system over a very long time. As England emerged as a single country, with a single currency, an early country to have a single currency, it emerged from warring Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The Romans left in 450, long period where there's not much history recorded. Then the Anglo-Saxons emerge in kingdoms with names like Wessex and Mercia still out there, often in police force names for some reason. And these Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were brought together into England by King Alfred, but they've formed the basis of even then, a sort of sub-national system at a time when communications were much less easy than they would be today, and understanding that if you lived in the West Country, you might live in somewhere called Wessex, and if you lived in Northumbria, that was different. You know, that's a sort of embedded, those names still live on here and there in governance. Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland, a much more complicated history. This, which I'm not going to deal with here in detail, safe to say that these are nations, separate nations, added to England over time to form the United Kingdom. That's quite a wide sweep of history, to put it like that. and others can tell you more and will. But what you can see from that way of them being added to England, either by conquest, particularly in the case of the Welsh, or voluntarily in the case of the Scots. Ireland is much more complicated than either of those two descriptions. Leave Matthew to talk to you about that. But you can see from that way in which these nations were added to England, which had emerged as early as 900 or 1000 to form the United Kingdom, that within those ancient nations there was inevitably always going to be a pressure for self-government, and that in turn has manifested itself as the pressures for devolution that we see around us today. So, I said I wouldn't go into this in detail, but conquest of Wales, the Act of Union in Scotland, conquest of Ireland, and the subsequent separation of the Republic of Ireland into a separate country again. But this, of course, is not a constitutionally driven creation of a single polity, a single political system, nor, as I've said already, a constitutionally based system of local or subnational government. So what we have within the United Kingdom is a local government system, a subnational government system, other than the earlier government in Scotland, which evolved organically. Shire-based justice, parish-based services within units often originating with church-based parish government and then becoming civil parishes as the basis of very rudimentary services in the 15th and 16th century, or even slightly before that. Very basic units of governments. The shires, the counties, were really units of national justice. The justices were appointed by the monarch to run the law and order and to raise a militia occasionally in the shires, the rural areas, and then in some parishes you had limited parish-based government. Remember, at this time, no big cities or towns really, apart from London and one or two places which were considered big cities and towns at the time, but which are not any longer. So Scotland and Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland, I should say, have long been governed to some extent separately. So despite the time, or throughout the period they've been within the United Kingdom, Scotland has had a separate system of government with its own laws, albeit until 1999 its own laws made in the Westminster Parliament, but there was separate legislation in Parliament made for Scotland, generally voted on, all MPs, but nevertheless Scottish laws seen as Scottish legislation and treated accordingly in Parliament. Northern Ireland had its own troubled Parliament at Stormont in Belfast, which also had an extraordinary degree of autonomy from the rest of the United Kingdom and the UK at Westminster. Now that, of course, led to a string of troubles, of which more a little later. Wales was latterly, and only really in the 1980s, separated from being governed as England and Wales, and many aspects of government are still run, even with the Welsh Assembly and government in Cardiff. So police, for example, is still run as an England and Wales matter. So in the classic British made-up-as-you-go-along constitutional arrangements, we still have some services only run for England, some for England and Wales, some for Great Britain, that's England, Wales and Scotland, and some for the United Kingdom, thus making all discussions, and I'll come back to this a little later, of English votes for English laws very, very difficult to deliver. There's been significant devolution to Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland since 1999, first to Scotland and Wales and then to Northern Ireland. And of course, local government, rather differently from all of this, evolved, as I say, over a very long time, subject to occasional parliamentary legislation, to turn the rather randomly evolved shire and parish-based government, and occasionally boroughs that were given charters, ancient cities. They were eventually universalised, not a word I like, and turned into larger units, and so there was a consistent system across the whole of England and Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland. So, we've had, as I say, long-established separate arrangements for the partly separate governments of Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. Wales traditionally had a Welsh office, with offices in London and an administration in Cardiff, its own Secretary of State and a grand committee of MPs, and only Welsh MPs in Parliament. Scotland, as I say, had its own laws passed in the Westminster Parliament until 1999, the Scottish office with a Scottish Secretary of State and a grand committee in Parliament. Some of these things have lived on, but not all of them. And in Northern Ireland, rule either from Stormont or till the Troubles overwhelmed it, and it was decided to introduce direct rule from London of Northern Ireland, which was in, Matthew? 1972, the Heath government, thank you very much. But again, with the Northern Ireland office, its own Secretary of State, and some laws that were specific to Northern Ireland. So, as you've heard every week so far, the constitutional arrangements of the United Kingdom are evolved and different and not subject to an actual written constitution, and all of this has evolved over time within that system. Now, devolutionary pressures built up, first, it must be said, in Ireland, pressures for Irish Home Rule in the 19th century. There were bitter debates which do hold up something of a mirror to what's gone on in Scotland this year, actually, the Irish Home Rule debates, which Matthew knows vastly more about than I do. And that had the effect, eventually, of Ireland becoming a separate state with its own government again in Dublin, and the northern counties of the island of Ireland detaching themselves at the point of that settlement and becoming, in effect, a fourth part of the United Kingdom, a sort of nation within the island of Ireland. The language used to describe all of this is complicated. There were periodic pressures in the rest of Britain, England, Wales and Scotland, for the devolution of power to Cardiff and Edinburgh. That's during the 20th century. There was a report on devolution published, the Kilbrandon Report, published in 1973, where legislation was published, but actually the proposals finally failed in Parliament. And then more recently in 1997, the Labour government, which took office in that year, was committed to devolution to Scotland and Wales, and to a much lesser extent and in a different form to London. So what does Wales have today? Well, Wales, which after all is still for, as I said, for Home Office purposes, part of England and Wales, but for many other purposes, has full devolution of the NHS, so National Health Service in Wales is run by the government in Cardiff, education, though not higher education, social care and the whole of local government, all of that is run by, or is responsibility of the Welsh Government, which can now, has its own quasi-legislative powers in place. It can effectively ask for its own legislation now to affect these services. It has an assembly elected every 4 years through a form of proportional representation, which is used in Scotland and in London as well. Additional member system. It has its own government and its own First Minister, Carwyn Jones, who is, the most important political figure in Wales. The Welsh Government inherited the Welsh Office Civil Service, which was a separate institution already running services for the UK government in Wales. No real difficulty with the civil service there. Up till now, the Welsh Government has not had any tax-raising powers. Since it was set up in 1999, it's operated simply with a direct grant paid by the Westminster Government, subject to effectively what's called the Barnett formula, which is simply rules that sustain Wales and Scotland's share of public spending broadly where they were in the 1970s. There's been a couple of commissions, the Holtham Commission and the Silk Commission, in the last few years, which have proposed to devolve taxation powers for Wales. And latterly, the UK government has made proposals for some tax devolution, for stamp duty, for landfill tax, and possibly even after a referendum for a local income tax for Wales. Now, it's more difficult to devolve some taxes to Wales than you might think, partly because Wales has a relatively low GDP per head, and therefore the buoyancy of its tax base is rather less than, per capita, England or even Scotland, or Scotland. Anyway, so that's Wales. Scotland Scotland has a full parliament in Edinburgh, which has legislative power over most domestic policy, the NHS, education, including higher education, famously, social care and local government, and of course is subject now to negotiations after the referendum to take over more powers, possibly over some aspects of welfare, which would be very radical, and even over the possibility of borrowing outside Treasury control. That's all being negotiated as we discuss it, as we meet today. It has its own government and First Minister. It too inherited the Scottish Office, in its case the Scottish Office Civil Service, which was pre-existing when devolution took place. Scotland already had its own government in Edinburgh, although laws were then previously passed in London. It too has had a commission to look at taxation, because although it was given very limited potential tax-raising powers when the Scottish Parliament was created in 1999, it's never used them. It is now to be given powers over stamp duty, landfill tax and income tax. This is being negotiated as part of the post-devolutionary, post-referendum settlement. This is, as it were, being discussed as we speak. And there is likely to be very radical devolution of tax-raising powers to Scotland. The Scottish Conservatives, interestingly, during the referendum debate, proposed that all of income tax should be devolved. Which would be very radical, and of course in some ways you could go to the point where all taxes were devolved to Scotland, and the UK government just precepted off it, but we're not going to go quite that far. This is all very topical politically at the moment, and as I say, the Smith Commission was appointed on the morning after the referendum vote in September, appointed to examine proposals for further devolution to the Scottish Parliament and Government. That work is ongoing, and I think it may actually be due to report in 10 days. I think it's on the 30th of November. So we will hear more about that within the next few weeks. Northern Ireland. Now, the Northern Ireland system of government bears many similarities to Wales and Scotland. It has most domestic policy devolved to it: health service, education, social care, local government, block grant as to the other two nations. It has its own assembly, elected though using a different voting system. It uses the single transferable vote, not the additional member system. And it has a unique power-sharing administration, effectively requiring the major parties in the government in the Northern Ireland Assembly to share power. I say Matthew is a big expert on this, and it's unusual and very different to what goes on in the rest of the UK, and subject to a great deal of friction actually at the moment. Has its own government and First Minister with a powerful Deputy First Minister role. It inherited the Northern Ireland Office Civil Service, and it has no tax-raising powers. And interestingly, I was at a seminar, a conference in Northern Ireland about a month ago, where listening to, because it is interesting how the traditional politics of Northern Ireland play out, where the local government minister was also speaking at this conference. It was a public event, so no secrets. And of course, he's a unionist politician, and he was making the case about how difficult it would be to devolve substantial financing powers to Northern Ireland, given that it too, like Wales, had rather a weak tax base. My guess is that a nationalist politician might have taken a different view on that. I mean, it's just that so the minister with the portfolio can affect public policy in a very interesting way in North. Is that true, Matthew? Does that make sense? Yeah. And it was just interesting to hear it. So currently no tax-raising powers and actually no proposals, apart from a discussion about whether Northern Ireland, this is slightly separate to devolved power, whether Northern Ireland should have a lower corporation tax level in order to compete with Ireland, which is, of course, with which it has a land border. And then there's London. Now, London is not really a region, it's a sort of city region inside England. But interestingly, because the Greater London Council, which is London's form of citywide government which had existed from 1965 to 86 was swept away, abolished in 1986. There was no citywide government. So at the point devolution was being pushed through in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, the Blair government also introduced sort of regional government in England. I personally prefer to see it as city regional. This is the only version of regional government in England. It's quasi-devolutionary. It was there were elements of constitutional reform about it, part devolutionary, part local government. It has a directly elected mayor, the first such figure, an Americanized political figure introduced into the British political system for the first time, with an assembly, like the ones in Scotland and Wales, elected by a form of proportional representation. But interestingly, given that this was an American system of government, or based on an American system of government, and imported into the UK, it didn't involve a separation of powers between the mayor and the assembly. The mayor is in effect legislature and executive rolled together. The assembly simply can oversee the mayor. The assembly can produce reports on the mayor's activities, but the assembly doesn't pass laws as they would do in an American city council. The mayor of London, the Greater London Authority, has powers over transport, your buses and tubes you use, and bike system parked outside, police indirectly, planning, fire and emergencies. So the mayor is what academics would call a strong mayor, but in a relatively weak system of city government, in the sense that the boroughs in London collectively have rather more power than the mayor does, in fact. So it's a strong mayor, but within a relatively weak mayoral system. And limited tax-raising powers. Oddly, the Mayor of London does have tax-raising powers through a levy on the council tax and also all the fares you and we all pay, which is not quite tax-raising, but it's analogous to it. So London is the nearest England has to devolved government. I should add that efforts were made to produce further devolution in England, but they failed largely because the offer to the English regions outside London was so modest that when there was a referendum on it in the northeast in 2004, it was rejected. Now, these devolved nations, they're funded through a block grant from the UK government, as I said. This grant is based on the Barnett formula, named after a minister in the Labour government between 1974 and 1979, Joel Barnett, who sadly died a couple of weeks ago. He said as recently as this year he never intended it to last this long. It was simply a way of effectively keeping the balance of resources between England and Wales and England and Scotland, and in the end England and Northern Ireland, broadly where it was in the 70s, and it's stayed there ever since. And of course, what devolution has allowed, particularly in Scotland and Wales, is those countries, those nations, to pursue a number of policies that differ substantially from England. Most notably, and easily understood here, university tuition fees, but prescription charges, fees for care for the elderly are amongst a number of things that have been done differently in Edinburgh and Cardiff than they have in the UK government in London. So is this a federal United Kingdom? Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland resemble states or provinces in a federal system. I think the Scots in particular, Scotland's government, and certainly after the reforms that are likely to take place in the coming year or so, or whenever legislation goes through on this, do resemble a state or province in a federal system of government. And indeed you can see the Scottish National Party, as it gears itself up for the general election in the UK, is looking for all the leverage it can get by winning seats in the general election, hoping perhaps that there'll be nobody will win, no major party will win, there'll be no majority parliament, and then they can exercise even more leverage over the development of a separate system of government for Scotland. They still have little tax-raising power, though that's about to change. And they do have lawmaking powers, particularly in Scotland and to a lesser extent in Wales and to an even lesser extent for Northern Ireland. UK government retains sovereignty, as I said at the very beginning. There is no constitutional protection in all of this system. There isn't some large, some written document that says these things cannot be changed without the Scottish and Welsh or Northern Irish governments assenting to it, as might happen, for example, in the United States. There's none of that. Or by a two-thirds majority or any of that, none of that protection. So abolition of all of this is possible by an act of Parliament in one afternoon. It has to go through the House of Lords, of course. And of course, just as a reminder of that, although it was a very different form of government, London-wide government was abolished in 1986, as were the city-wide governments in the other big cities in England and eventually Strathclyde in Scotland. So things that look quite unusual by the standards of international constitutional practice will happen from time to time, largely because there are no constitutional protections in the system. So what to do about England? England has no devolved or regional government, for the reasons I explained a moment ago. There was a referendum about the possibility in the northeast, but it was rejected, and that meant the then Labour government simply abandoned going any further. There is the so-called West Lothian problem as a result of there being no devolved government in England, which is that Scottish and Welsh MPs vote on England-only laws in the UK Parliament. In fairness to SNP votes, they've chosen not to SNP MPs, they've chosen not to do that. But this matters enormously for the Labour Party and therefore for the Conservatives, because Labour has a large block of Scottish MPs. The Conservatives only have one MP in Scotland, so it matters rather less. And Wales has a more plural mixture of MPs. So the question of whether Scottish and Welsh MPs should vote on England-only laws when their MPs, of course, can't vote on, particularly in Scotland, legislation passed about, say, education or health in Scotland. Cabinet Office has considered England-only Commons votes, and indeed as a result of the Scottish referendum, these issues have all become very current again. This is a debate that's ongoing in a cabinet committee inside government and separately with the Labour Party and others outside government putting in their proposals. This will be dealt with, I'm afraid, it's an odd way of doing it, by the major parties putting proposals into their manifestos for the next general election. This is the way we do constitutional reform in Britain. And so we will get a sort of menu of what the Labour Party is offering, what the Conservatives are offering, what the Lib Dems are offering, what the SNP is offering and or wants. Welsh nationalists, Plaid Cymru no doubt, in their manifestos at the next election. This will then all be sorted out by either a majority government or a coalition government. Could be a complicated coalition government after the next general election. The Scottish vote has yet again provoked the question of whether there should be an English parliament. If Scotland has a parliament, Wales effectively has a parliament, Northern Ireland has something, an assembly akin to a parliament, why shouldn't England? Now, some people would see this as passing power from Westminster to Westminster, given how big England is within the United Kingdom. And this does point to a constitutional problem for the UK, which is it's sort of quasi-federal, but with England, 52 million people out of 62 million. So it's however you configure it, it's a very dominant part, England, within the United Kingdom. And there are those who believe, academics who believe that, in a sense, the English have to hold back within the United Kingdom and allow the Scots, the Welsh and the Northern Irish some freedom, effectively some advantages, because that's a counterbalance to the domination of England within the United Kingdom. You can see the logic to that. There is no one land in Germany, no one state in America that is 52/62 of the country. And imagine trying to make the Senate work in the US if it were like that. So that's the problem that the poor old... It's not just that we don't have a written constitution. We have a sort of quasi-federal system with one part of the federal system, England, being vastly bigger than the other three parts added together. And this has led to questions about could we have devolution not to regions but to city regions. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. Now, let me move on to local government. Local government is long evolved. The City of London, which also nearly bound, just the other side of Lincoln's Inn Fields, on the other side of 32 Lincoln's Inn Fields, lies the City of London, always recognisable by the heraldic griffins that stand on plinths on either side of the road when you go into the city, and because suddenly all the lights are attached to the buildings and not standing on lamp posts. Very different place, the city. It was first given a charter by King William Normandy in 1067. As I said earlier, shires, counties were the basis of civil justice throughout Britain, throughout England and Wales and then Scotland. What happened, of course, is that important cities and towns eventually involved boroughs or councils and sought parliamentary powers to provide a basis for them to act locally, to hold elections and to raise taxes. This was on the basis of an earlier evolution of parishes, as I said earlier, becoming the basis of local provision way back in the mists of time, notably following the passage of the Poor Law. Now, the Poor Law in 1601, in the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, is often seen as the beginning of local government because it created a power for a form of tax raising on the basis of property by parishes to pay for the relief of the poor. It's not exactly the welfare state, this, I can assure you, but it is the very basis of it's the beginning of the basis of some local provision. Subsequently, Parliament from time to time created ad hoc authorities, gave some boroughs charters, created trusts to provide local roads and water supplies. It all evolved in a rather random way until the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution saw the growth of what were, by the standards of their times, megacities, in a way that we see China and India and Latin America developing vast cities bigger than anything that's been seen before today. Cities like Manchester and Birmingham and Glasgow and Leeds and Sheffield were in their time like that, growing at enormous speed. By hundreds of thousands of people a year as people moved off the land in the 19th century, living in large industrial cities with no government. So the city fathers, and they were men at the time, went to Parliament and business leaders with what was described as enlightened self-interest, i.e. it was in their own interest, but it led to good things for other people as well. Went to petition Parliament to get powers to set up municipal corporations, local government units. Most famously, Joseph Chamberlain, who was the mayor of Birmingham. Birmingham is seen as the zenith, Birmingham in its heyday, the zenith of this form of city government. Of course, this is in a period from the end of the 19th century through into the beginning of the 20th century, where Birmingham Corporation and other city councils were building tramways, putting in water systems, baths, places for people to wash who couldn't afford their own baths, a whole range of public services. Remembering, of course, that cities were the basis of most domestic government. The UK government was much more interested in running the empire and the dominions than Britain. So this was really all of domestic government. At the end of the 19th century, with this rather random evolution of city government and not so much in the counties, Parliament legislated to ensure that all parts of the country, and separately in Scotland, had one or two levels of local government, generally one in cities and other urban areas and two in shire areas. So where the population was thin, you get a big county and within it smaller districts, and in cities a great big urban municipal corporation. And with modifications, this system remains today. The vestiges, they've been combined into bigger authorities from time to time, but this is vestigially the system we now have. Don't need to remember this, these slides will be available. But what's important about this, and I'll come back to this at the very end, is how few municipalities this country has. So what we have here are primary authorities across England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. Oh, and by the way, the Northern Ireland number is being reduced. The Welsh number is being reduced. So we're barely 400 upper tier and district municipalities compared with France, which has the same population and has 36,000. So this is these units are very large by international standards. And so the London borough of Camden, where we are now, with 250,000 people in it, is massive by the standards of municipalities in most parts of the world. What do these municipalities run? Broadly the same across England, Wales and Scotland. They run parts of education, some element of school education, more in Scotland and Wales actually than in England, and adult education. Social care for older people and children. Some parts of social housing are still run by local government, though not all. Highways, libraries, you can read the list, I'm not going to go through all this list. They're responsible for local tax collection and also actually for administering elections. May not seem a hugely important role, but actually if you think about it, it's the basis of all of democracy, as is local government more generally. It's funded, local government that is, as it's the only institution apart from Parliament or government that currently can set its own taxation, apart from the Scots' powers which they haven't thus far used. Local government, which is all of subnational government for these purposes, determines about 5% of all the taxes set in the United Kingdom. So it's not a big tax-raising power, but what it means is that broadly the council tax represents about a third of local government income, or if you put schools in, which are funded through a direct grant, about a quarter. So it's heavily dependent on central government funding, and that means a significant degree of central government influence, but it does have its own elections, and there's no question local authorities have very different policies from place to place, even neighbours. Now, this system and this long-evolved system of local government has been in decline. I'm just going to talk about England here, though this is not dissimilar in Scotland and Wales. We've seen local government declining from being about half of all UK public expenditure, and therefore half the state, to about a quarter. We've seen hospitals transferred out of local government and to create the National Health Service after the war, big growth in central grants in the 1950s and 60s, public health, the ambulance service, some housing transferred in the 70s from local government to government bodies, or quangos, higher education, council housing, sales and rate capping all happened in the 1980s. The 80s was a very complicated decade for the relationship between central and local government. And then in the 1990s, FE colleges, further education colleges, were removed and transferred to a quango, as polytechnics, the advanced further education institutions, had been in the previous decade. Some schools now are transferring, academies. Some of you may have been to an academy. Well, they're all now directly run as are free schools, they are responsibility of national government to get funding from the Department for Education. Whereas most schools remain local government schools, but they get their funding through a formula which central government determines. So some schools have been transferred away from local government. And of course, over time, more council housing has been transferred into the control of housing associations. So all of this has taken services away from local government and generally handed them across to government-appointed bodies, or even in some cases to the private sector. We have regular reforms of local government throughout the United Kingdom. This is as true in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland as it is in England. Most structural reforms reduce the number of councils and councillors. They simply mean there are fewer after the reform than before. There's a powerful desire within central government to have efficient units. Efficient means bigger. And you can see, of course, in Scotland, they've ended up with a single police service for the whole of Scotland. In England, there are still over 40, England and Wales, over 40 police forces. But a lot of pressure to have police forces merged to come up with ever bigger police authorities because of a strong sense in central government that bigger is efficient. Go on like this, we just have one local authority in England, and that would be central government, of course. But there is a powerful desire for efficiency. And of course, this all raises a generic and wider question of whether local government is an independent or at least an autonomous elective institution with its own powers, or an agency of central government. Does it really just exist to deliver services such as housing benefits, which it does, part of the social security system, as an agency of central government, or is it like a mini parliament with its own power at the local level? Certainly what it was in the 19th century. Any of you who've been to or know great provincial cities of England, true in Scotland and Wales actually, they have beautiful and ornate town halls. Some of them, like Manchester Town Hall, as big and looking like the Palace of Westminster. There's a physical representation of the power of those municipalities when they were in their heyday in the 19th and early 20th century. And of course, and I've hinted at this already, local government isn't just local government. It is the basis of parliamentary democracy and parties. Every MP has to go back at the end of the week. I say this has to because some of them think of it, I'm sure they love doing it. But, to go back at the end of the week to their constituencies where they meet their local party. Now, some of them have a really good relationship with the local party, but some of them don't. But the local party is essentially going to be made up of people who are either on the council or people who are hoping to get on the council. That is the local power base. And so local government is really the origin of all political power. And if it doesn't work, then the question is, how would the national political parties raise money, get members, raise money through members and so on. So local government has a number of very important roles as the starting point for the rest of British democracy. As I say, remembering all MPs in the end, whether they like them a lot or not, go back to their local areas, and they like the areas generally, but whether the councillors can be more complicated. But they have to live with them, they have to deal with them, they are the basis of local democracy. And as I said, local government organises local elections. So this is the part of government that arranges all elections, including subnational and national ones. I mentioned this point earlier, but just to remake it, France, which has a population of 62 million, exactly the same as the UK, fractionally bigger, 36,000 communes. Sweden, a population of 9.5 million, which is slightly bigger than London, has 290 municipalities. London has 33, 34 with the mayor. Germany, 82 million, bigger country, 13,000 municipalities. And the dear old UK, and if you look at the OECD statistics on this, easily accessed, the LSE paid for a membership for us all, you can get some beautiful charts about how out of line the UK is in terms of having so few municipalities. Now, it's true there are parishes and town councils and community councils, but they have very little real power. So this is a very unusual setup we have here in the UK. Now, very briefly, I just wanted to look at a typology that Jerry Stoker, who's an academic at Southampton, who's actually going to be speaking on this course next term, generated to compare the UK system of local government with other systems as to what its key function is. You may say, well, it's obvious what local government is. It's there to be elected, raise taxes, to deliver services. But what this analysis tries to do is to sort of just to show how local government systems, and it goes back to some extent to what I was saying right at the beginning about the different functions local democracy and subnational democracy can fulfill. So Jerry Stoker has divided it into is a number of functions, really. Functions including identity, economic development, welfare, and what he calls lifestyle coordination. Think about that. And if you think about France with that 36,000 municipalities, any of you know France, tiny, tiny villages, each with its own mairie, town hall, always a tricolour hanging outside it. Very, very strong on identity. La France profonde undoubtedly has a very strong sense of local identity. The mayor is very important in the way local people in France understand their area. Some mayors are actually also members of parliament and have leading roles at the national government level. There's a dual mandate, less than there used to be, but still in France to a substantial degree. Something similar in Italy. Another purpose for local government would be economic development. So this is, and again, you can see this very clearly in literature about what, if you look at the Brookings Institute and Bruce Katz's work about why, or Ben Barber's work on cities, both about the America, which effectively argues that if it isn't metropolitan and local government, then federal government just can't do it. So that, you know, the purpose of city governments is economic development. And he also would argue China fell in this category as well, that the city governments in China are now building up their city fast with a very powerful mandate to turn them into economic development units. That's definitely different to what a French small parish or, commune would see itself as doing. Then welfare. Now, remembering what I said about the origins of the poor law, and welfare actually was a major part of local government in Britain until relatively recently. So here he's looking at a welfare function, and I'm not saying any of these are mutually exclusive, by the way. If you look at British local government, you'd say it fulfilled all of these. But a welfare provision as a provider of services and also to provide services for clients. Sweden, preeminently. If you look at Sweden, Norway, Denmark, municipalities there, raise a local income tax and are capable of powerful redistribution within their areas, but they also provide health and education at the local level. So they're local providers of welfare services. And he argues that Brazil and South Africa are similar in this regard. And then finally, what he calls lifestyle coordination, a broad and changing mix of individuals and groups in the community and those who lead community governance. These are what American academics would call growth coalitions or urban coalitions in cities. So bringing together, here the role of the municipality, the local authority, is not necessarily to deliver services, though it does that to some extent, or to provide identity, though it may do that to some extent, or to develop the area economically, which they clearly do more, interestingly, now than in the past. But it's really to act as a sort of coordinator of local elected interests and public services, appointed bodies, the NHS, national government services, and also the private sector into a sort of coalition of governance, a different word, governance. Not government, but governance, trying to create coalitions. And you can see this very clearly in the way London government works, close at hand. If you look at the way in which the Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, works, and his predecessor, Ken Livingstone, worked with the business community and community organisations. It's not unique to this system or this city, but it's clearly an example of this. Now, I'm not saying, as I say, any of these are mutually exclusive, but they're a way of thinking about the different roles that local government can have. And they link to some extent to what I was talking about right at the beginning of the lecture. So, just to conclude, a number of questions, it seems to me, come out of all of this. First, does the fact that the United Kingdom has no written constitution leave subnational government susceptible to reform and the removal of powers? Well, I think the answer to that question is yes, remarkably prone to that. Now, that can go both ways. It would be possible for national government suddenly to give subnational government much more power. There's some of this going on in Greater Manchester at the moment, where the government is handing some additional power back to the Greater Manchester group of authorities. On the other hand, devolution to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland has gone on against the trend of this centralisation within England, taking powers from local government. Powers handed to Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland have definitely moved the other way within this system without a written constitution. And again, very easy to do this. So it can go both ways relatively swiftly. Second question, and I hinted at this, are UK municipalities, councils, too large to allow the expression of identity? If you look at a list of council names, you'll find names, nothing against them of course, like Three Rivers. Anybody know where Three Rivers is? No, why should, unless you come from Three Rivers. Well, I mean, there's a lot of stress and strain in trying to come up with a name for municipalities that aren't a place where people would recognise one of the towns within it. And within London you have boroughs that have names that are not names of any of the places inside the area. Waltham Forest, for example. Waltham Forest consists of 4 places where we would have heard of the names, like Leytonstone, Leighton, Chingford, Walthamstow. But the borough is called Waltham Forest, which was an attempt, to keep everybody happy and not, see how that happened. So, And so the expression of identity may be obscured by the size of British municipalities, arguably. Can subnational and local government be autonomous if it has very little fiscal freedom, which it does? Remembering only 5% of all the taxes paid in the UK are, or that all of us pay, are collected by local government. And even that's capped, actually. So it's very little fiscal freedom compared with most other countries with which Britain would normally be compared. Do comparative analyses suggest that the UK is an outlier in terms of devolution and decentralisation? Well, actually, the recent devolution to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland is quite a radical shift one way, but in terms of centralisation within England over time, the other way. So it is an example of both in some ways. So it's an outlier twice, I would argue. How will Scotland's position affect devolution within England? Well, who knows? This is one of the great political matters of the moment, which, as I say, is being played out miles away from here and in Scotland, and will be a feature of the manifestos written by the political parties in the run-up to the general election in May next year. And finally, what are the implications for the core of central government, that is the Westminster and Whitehall machine for this system? It is a very centralised system. And it may be argued to lead to a form of government where central government has much of the power in the centre in London, but because of that, it's sort of too strong and yet not quite powerful enough to do much with the power because there's so much of it gathered together. And that's certainly what some of those who are advocating greater devolution to city and perhaps county government in England are hoping will convince this government and its successor to hand more power down to city and county regions. Right, that's where I'm going to stop. It's a brief canter through the large subject of subnational and local government, and I'm very happy to take questions, comments for the next sort of 10 minutes or so. Please. Oh, can you wait for the microphone to rush across to you?
Hi. I just wondered whether or not you had an opinion about the bankers' fines that have happened recently with the FCA and how that might filter through to the subnational local government level in terms of funding the NHS.
Right. So, well, I mean, I think that what's going on in the banking world is in many ways a world unto itself, and I'm not saying that the large fines exacted from banks won't have an impact on the public finances. But I'm going to talk about that next week. So if you can hold your fire, it'll be a more relevant question when we come to look at the public finances next week. I think directly influencing on this, not much, but it may affect at the margin on the public finances. But I'll talk about that next time, if that's all right. Yeah, please.
I think the question of identity is quite an important one, especially when there are I wouldn't say so many layers of government, but there are a number of layers of government where the boundaries are all different. So obviously in the sort of national parliamentary level, you have your UK Parliament constituencies, and then you have councils and borough councils and city councils and whatever, and then you have the regions of England as they are in the European elections. So I think in order for sort of local government to create some sort of identity, there has to be kind of the boundaries have to be in some way congruent with each other.
Well, but it's an interesting point. I mean, I've hinted at. I mean, it's true. There's a fair amount of opinion polling which suggests pretty clearly that the public is confused by which which parts of government are responsible for what. So if you ask people, is local government responsible for the National Health Service? Many of them will say yes. Not all, but some of them will say yes. Is the government responsible for schools, central government? Well, some of them will say yes, and that would be partly right, actually, because it's in any area, it'll be some of it central government, some of it local government. So the question of which level of government is responsible for the delivery of a particular service is genuinely foxing and opinion polling. Maury's done a lot of work on this, if you want to look at it. It is genuinely confusing, I think. And, in fairness, it would be easy to say government was willfully complex, but I think in any developed society, government is always complex. There's just so many things government is trying to do, different institutions set up at different times. In a sense, it's a complex world and we end up with complex institutional mechanisms. However, the question of whether they are less good if they don't reflect, which I think I also heard in your question, if they don't reflect some form of identity, which I talked about a bit, is an interesting one. I mean, if people feel really strongly about a city that they live in Manchester, let us say, and they care about it, you might think that they would be more likely to put pressure on councillors to make it good and work than if they it's called, East Barsetshire, I make somewhere up, so it's not to insult anywhere. It's not actually made up, it's from fiction, so it's sort of not even fictional fiction. Barsetshire, and you don't really know where that is, or you just don't feel part of it. And it's a very, very intriguing question, even in London. If you go out of London, people in inner London who've lived in something called London for 140 years definitely think of themselves as London. Some people on the edge of London who don't live in London postal districts think of themselves living in Croydon, Surrey, or Bromley, Kent. Now, does that mean they respond differently? I mean, there's a nice research project actually to be done here, not one I'm sure I've ever seen done. So whether feeling a sense of identity that you recognise with the place that's delivering your local government and you're voting councillors to, whether that actually strengthens your interest in local democracy is an interesting question. I'd hypothesise it would, but I'm not sure of research that actually suggests that that's true. So it's a fascinating question. And of course, if you go back to France with its 30-odd thousand units of government, you can be sure that some little commune or some tiny sub-commune will have sub-area will have its own mayor with its own town hall and its own flag hanging on the town hall. And that does create very powerful sense of identity. And it's entirely congruent with the units of government. And it's fair to say that many French politicians at upper levels of government think there are far too many communes in France, but nobody's been able to do anything about it. Other countries, Germany notably, has had reorganisations of local government, like Britain, to reduce the number of units. Yeah, please. Oh, actually, do you want to go here?
Thank you. Professor, let's say Cambridge or Oxford, are they doing courses like this to teach people about the British government as well? One.
Right, okay.
And secondly, the independence of Ken Livingstone, for instance, had a mayor of London, and he got that through we in the Labour Party talking to Labour government and they're not listening, so Ken went off and be independent and he get that despite the furor that the main government was doing. My point is that the Queen asked us LSE a question. Are we doing something here at the LSE to combat what is happening now? And if it's so, we need to get it done before the election. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I'll come back to the second point at the end. I'll come and have a word with you at the end about that. On the Ken Livingstone as mayor point, I mean, your question is interesting because both Ken Livingstone as mayor and indeed Boris Johnson as mayor have to some extent tacked against their own party because of the nature of mayoral government, which is different in many ways to the traditional party-based government where, in Parliament as in local authorities, individuals elected are on a party basis, and the biggest group then selects, is the majority group, and their leader is either the leader of the council or the prime minister. When you have mayoral systems of government where the electorate is across 8.5 million people in London, an electorate of 5.5 million, you get pressures on the office holders, and this is true in American city governments as well, which are very different and tend to create independence from party. And if you look at any of the mayors, both the London-wide mayor or the borough mayors in Hackney or Newham or Lewisham in particular, and some of those outside London where they exist, they tend to be people who go for a sort of centrist more centrist than perhaps to the centre of their own previous centre of gravity, and perhaps even nearer the centre of political gravity than their own party. So, and we will, to answer indirectly your question, we will be doing more on these issues in the run-up to the general elections. I'll talk to you more about that after, if I might. Yeah, question here.
Just drawing on Stoker's function of economic development.
Yeah.
It seems that with the kind of call for a northern super city and more control or powers over infrastructure, that UK cities, certainly in the north of England, are kind of trying to draw that from Westminster, maybe because they feel like they're not getting as much out of the recession. What can you comment on that?
Now, it's true that one of the most interesting developments of the last 6 months, although actually in fairness to Greater Manchester, they started their work on so-called city regional government back in 2004 at about the time the North East regional referendum was not voted through. And I think that if you think about the northern cities of England, they've, like all of local government in England, suffered the decline of the powers and financial control that I've described. But in addition to that, feel, with some justification, they're a long way from the centre of power in London. I mean, in fairness to local authorities in London, I think they feel quite a long way from the centre of power in London, but that's another matter. And so what the Greater Manchester authorities have done is there are 10 authorities in Greater Manchester, and they have formed their own city, what they call a city regional grouping, and a combined authority. And that has negotiated with national government for more powers for the Greater Manchester 10. And indeed, as part of the negotiation, which they've done directly with the Treasury, with the Chancellor, they've agreed to have a city regional mayor. I wouldn't dare call it a Boris of the North, but I'm sure a politician might call it a Boris of the North. They will see it as their own mayor of Greater Manchester. And I was talking to Matthew about this before we started, with this fascinating, and if you wanted evidence of how the British constitutional arrangements will always be made up as we go along, what they're going to have is a directly elected mayor from 2017 for the 10 districts of Greater Manchester, which are an area about 4/5 the size of Greater London, so it's a big area, 10 districts inside it. But instead of having an assembly, as in London, which is directly elected, the leaders of the 10 district councils will be a kind of, my word, a senate, with powers potentially to veto the mayor. So it's a power-sharing arrangement between a city regional mayor, a metro mayor, and the 10 districts of the combined authority over which he or she will effectively sit. This is, in my view, it's a fascinating if you were making it up in a project, and why not, it's a new form of, I'm sure somewhere it'll exist, somebody will tell me, but it's certainly within the UK, a new form of citywide and local power balance, really. Very different to the London model. The London model, after all, has a directly elected mayor, an assembly who have no legislative functions, and they have a tiny veto power. They can veto the mayor's budget if they can get a 2/3 majority for an alternative proposition, which is a very high hurdle. So they can barely stop the mayor through that kind of voting power. And the boroughs in London do not have a direct control over what the mayor does. But in the Manchester model, the 10 boroughs, in effect, will, potentially. So it's a constitutional innovation. But to answer your question, I think that the northern region, or the authorities in the north of England, do feel cut off from power-making, decision-making in London, and they are to some extent. And giving them their own units of self-government, one might argue, could be the beginning of a solution to that problem. Because if they had their own powers and their own tax-raising powers as well, they would, this is back to the future stuff. This is what Manchester City Council would have been like, or Leeds or Birmingham, in the late 19th century. Admittedly at the city level, not the city regional level. So I think it is a response to a demand from the north for more devolved power, yeah. I'm afraid we must, all right, quickly now take one more. I have to take one more, sorry about that. Just take one, and then, it's not that I want to stop, it's just that other people will clamour to get in.
Yeah, it's good to ask. Do you think if we were to see more municipalities and a breakup of further breakup of boroughs in London, for example, do you think it could be an impediment to the effectiveness of policies, for example, if we wanted to push infrastructure? Do you think there could be more NIMBYism or more protectionist thinking when identity rises? Because if you're overseeing a smaller area, you're going to be more protective of it. It's going to be your home area. So what do you think?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, you could argue, and theoretically, you can argue this either way. One is, if you're having things done to you by a big, powerful upper tier, you get less opportunity to be NIMBY, but you'll fight harder to stop it. Whereas if you have more control over your own destiny at the local level, you'll be more likely to allow it to go through. Now, this debate's been fought out at scale during the present government's life over the question of building more housing. So, question, will people who are NIMBY-ish about housing be more likely to allow it through because of central government targets and a requirement for the council to do it, then it gets fought, or if they have a stake in neighbourhood and local planning, and they can then decide exactly what happens. And I have to say, as the government's trying to push it in the latter direction, it's hard to tell yet which way round it will work. But it's a great question. And, in a sense, it depends how. It could lead to more NIMBYism, but it could lead to greater empowerment and make it easier to make decisions. The question, because it also has to be seen against the backdrop of, do local people get any benefit from making a particular decision? Particularly, does their area keep yield of the growing tax base? And that's another element. We can perhaps talk about this offline, but it's a very interesting question and germane to what we've been talking about. Okay, thank you very much, and I'll see you next week. Thank you. See you then.